We're ready to begin the afternoon session. I am delighted to be able to introduce a good friend who played a big role in this exhibition. I have known Becky Duval-Reese for a number of years and got better acquainted with her about 1983, 84, 85, when she organized the last comprehensive exhibition of Texas art for the what is now the Blanton Art Museum at the University of Texas, then the Huntington Art Gallery. And I told her last night that the pages of her book in my library are beginning to fall out because I have turned those pages and used that book so many times. It's a wonderful reference, and with an essay by William H. Getzman, whom so many of the people on the program today trained with. Becky was curator at the Huntington. She later became director of the El Paso Art Museum and went through the building of a new museum, the building of a collection, the publication of 100 Texas works in the El Paso Art Museum collection, which is a fine book in itself, and successfully retired several years ago and now lives in San Marcos. And we're delighted to have Becky here to talk today about transcendency in Texas art. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, amplification working? Yes? Okay. I just wanted to say, wasn't that great that Ron showed photographs of the artist with those slides? You know, we were talking that, you know, how often you go in a museum and you look at the work and you forget the human being behind it. And I hadn't seen many of those photographs, and it just really brought the humanity into the imagery. So thanks for that. And you and Michael did a great job. So I'm glad there was 15 minutes at least between our talks. So I want to thank Reese, McDermott, and the staff again. I did that earlier today, but also Ron and Michael and all the curators and writers for their good work. I also can't be at the Witte without thinking of Cecilia Steinfeld, who, when I'm a native Texan, but when I lived outside Texas for about 6 years, and when I came back in 1976 to work at UT, I began to be interested in the art of Texas and the people around me, my place and my people. But I remember people saying, oh, Cecilia Steinfeld, she has this amazing file, but if she doesn't like you, she won't let you look. And I was really nervous about meeting her, but finally I did, and she really helped me a lot over the years. So, remembering Cecilia. One of the things I want to do today is I'll be hoping that you see with these images that most of the artists were trained, that art just didn't spring sui generis. The artists knew art, they had studied art, they had training, and they brought that, the immigrants brought that with them. The native Texans studied art in Texas, outside Texas, so artists were trained. And also, much of the imagery you're going to see today comes from images of exhibitions that I've organized in the past, or during my 15 years in El Paso, my interest in Texas art really helped me augment the permanent collection. So there are a lot of Texas art and artists in El Paso, and I'll be showing you some of those images. So Texas impressed early visitors by its size and scale, and some recorded their impressions of the land and the people they encountered. After a tour of the American West, 19th century French actress Sarah Bernhardt quipped, "After Paris, I would like to be a Texan best of all." Frederick Remington had said, "With me, cowboys are what gems and porcelains are to others." But on the other hand, General Phil Sheridan once wrote, "If I owned Texas and hell, I would rent out Texas and live in hell." And I share that quote with you because, as J. Frank Dobie once said, Texans enjoy bragging about the worst. So. And I'm a fourth generation Texan. My sons are fifth, but I think I'm in a room of people, so my fourth generation status, I'm a rank newcomer, so. But soon the West and Texas came to be seen as the same in popular culture. By the close of the frontier in the 1890s, Texas had a well-established mystique. Dime Western novels, Remington illustrations, letters home from soldiers and immigrants melded Texas and the West into one in the popular culture. A century later, while researching his novel Texas, James Michener remarked, "The one thing I've been most surprised by is that Texans actually believe the myths about their state." Because Texas myths are so much a part of our world, it is no wonder Texans don't wish to separate the two. Throughout the state's history, images made tangible by the many artists who immigrated to, traveled around, settled in, and chose to live in Texas helped us to know and understand our past. Oops. Okay. In 1836, there were 218 Germans in Texas. By 1846, there were 7,000. Through immigration, Henri Castro, who was from Alsace-Lorraine, contracted with the Republic of Texas to settle 600 French families in Castroville, 25 miles west of San Antonio. And Galveston in the 1840s was the second largest port of entry after Ellis Island. Numerous German immigrants would write about being kept on ships for several days because of the numbers of immigrants being processed through Galveston. The artist Herman Lundquist once said and wrote and said, "Tell them of our going to Texas. The news from there is very favorable, and we are looking forward to a pleasant future." And outstanding among the Germans, I'm just a little bit off of my slides. I'm going to see if I can go back just a second. We're going there. Okay. On the left is Frederick Richard Petrie's Plains Indian in blue, and Herman Lundquist's Falls of the Colorado River. So we're talking about the Lundquists and the Petrie's family. They were German artists immigrating to Texas, Lundquist and Petrie. They had met and become close friends at the Academy of Fine Arts in Dresden, where they took part in the street fighting of 1849 while students. 1848 and 49, it was like a pan-European revolution. So much of industrialization had brought so much division between the poor and the rich, and there was revolution in numerous countries in Europe. And these two artists were part of that German revolution. But reprisals soon, within a year, the governments squashed most of the revolutions. So that forced these two men to choose to immigrate to America. And before leaving Germany, Lundquist married Petrie's sister Elizabeth. And by 1850, they were 10 months into their travel. Ultimately, that brings them to the Pedernales River in Fredericksburg. They made a living farming. Here are middle-class, well-educated German families learning to farm. And so while they worked and struggled with the land, they also found time for their art. This bucolic 19th century, very kind of classical painting from that period by Lundquist, really shows the typical landscape, the foreground, the middle ground, the background, and also that romanticism of the lone figure in the landscape was typical, and the palette also of Lundquist. As far as the other image, Petrie he too was trained, and he made many sketches, drawings. I love the image you showed, Ron, earlier of that unfinished work by Petrie. But this small vignette really captures, captures, I think, the Germans' feeling of their relationship with the Indians, with the Native Americans. They were always, they were not at odds with the families in much of their renderings. So let's see. So now we're looking at Theodore Gentile, his camel painting. Gentile was one of the settlers from Paris who came to Castroville. He ultimately moved to San Antonio. He was very prolific. He did diverse renderings, missions, genre scenes, pioneer Indian life. But in this painting, The Camel Experiment of 1856, depicts the Secretary of State Jefferson Davis's idea that camels would provide dependable means of transportation for Army supply posts in the arid, semi-arid regions of the country. So the camels entered through Indianola, and it didn't work. The soldiers didn't particularly like trying to work with camels, and the smell of the camels stampeded the cows. So it was a short-lived experiment. And the other painting is by Karl Iwanski, the Terry Rangers. Iwanski also was a German immigrant who came to this part of the country, but like so many of the German immigrants, he and his father were outspoken Union supporters. And so it's kind of paradoxical in a way that in around 1862, he painted this group portrait of Texas soldiers on their way to fight in the Civil War. And B.F. Terry, the organizer, and the man in the red shirt, actually died in the first battle. But Iwanski and his father were outspoken defenders of the Union. And at this time, the Germans had to be fairly, they often had to be very careful in their political discourse. Germans were lynched. Many Germans left Texas. Many went to Mexico at this time. So in a way, it's a bit paradoxical that this amazing portrait of Rangers or soldiers off to war was actually, Civil War was painted by a Union supporter. So, somehow my images and my note cards are not together, so excuse me. The most accomplished sculptor to immigrate to Texas in the 19th century was Elizabeth Ney, whose determination gained her entrance to the Munich Academy, where in 1852 she became the first woman to enter the sculpture department. For this daughter of a German stone carver, trampling tradition made her life worthwhile. Always outside the traditional, Ney met and ultimately married a philosophy student, Edmund Montgomery, and in 1870, they left politically charged Germany and Ney's already prominent studio life for the United States. The couple settled in Texas after 1873, but for 20 years, Ney put her sculpture away and really tended to a business, to a farm. And she quit making art for 20 years. But by 1890, she began her artwork again, which was a neoclassical style that looked to Greek and Roman precedents. And with her white marble portraits of famous statesmen, she transformed them into heroic figures. In Texas, she found herself as successful as she had been in Germany. And her life-size figures of Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin now preside in the state rotunda of the Capitol, while this important marble sculpture of Lady Macbeth is in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art in DC. Elizabeth Ney's studio is operated as a museum in Austin, and it's wonderful. You step inside and you can see this picture of her in her studio, and that is a self-portrait that she made. But that studio still feels like it does in that picture, and it's a wonderful place to visit, and I'm really happy that the Austin Parks Department is keeping that available for us. Let me see where I am. Where are we? Now we're looking at Pompeo Copini, and in 1982, 84, I began to do research on a project, a history of a century of sculpture in Texas. And at that time, the Copini studio was open here in San Antonio, and I made these photographs there on the left in his studio, and they were just all these plaster models for various sculptures of his that were on display, and it was so much fun being there. It was free. It was in the sense that there were no museum labels. It was just open. You could look and really get close to those plaster models. The image at the top is the model for the bronze sculpture that was in the Century of Art show, and that is part of the Huntington Art Gallery at UT. So it was entitled The First Catch of 1832. And then these images, also from that trip to his studio, are of models for the Little Phil Fountain that was the major fountain on the campus at UT Austin that was dedicated in 1933. And his idea about this image was it was after the Civil War. He wanted the idea of soldiers coming together and after that war. So it was, it's the major photo op at UT Austin, so. But I think you all probably, I missed the sculpture talk earlier today on Copini, but I hope those of you who saw it, will realize his importance to the state in sculpture and his importance to San Antonio in Texas. So, yeah, the little Phil fountain was really signifying the reunification of the North and the South after the Civil War. Folks, I don't know what's happened to my slides, but they're totally coming up random, so I'm having to go through my notes here for you, so this is a bit troubling. So, excuse me, just a second. I like talking from notes because for me it's always been so much freer, but then when your notes and your images get out of order, and I'm only going through this because there's a great quote, if I can find it, from Clara McDonald Williamson that I want to read to you, and then otherwise I'm just going to freeform it from here and forget the notes. How's that? So, yeah. So this is Clara McDonald Williamson, who the story Jerry Bywaters told me was that when she was 68, she had raised her family, she decided to study art, and so she was taking classes in the Dallas Museum School. And Jerry Bywaters told me he walked through the class and he saw her painting, and he said to her, "Get out of here, go home and paint. If you take classes, this natural folk art style of yours is going to be lost." And so, but he did talk about her work with the Valley House owner, Donald Vogel. And so the Vogels forever promoted Clara McDonald Williamson, who really became our Grandma Moses, and I think she was called Aunt Clara. But she was, for Bywaters to see, this naive talent, but how strong it was, and to say, "You don't want to be here, go home and paint," and she did. But I love what she said about her work. She said, "I was raised for the most part by old women. I use the words raised and old with deliberateness, for they go together. I was raised also by two old Texans, one a great-grandmother who had frontiered it in an Erath County dugout, had killed a panther with an axe, and made her own soap almost to the day of her death. I have always had a fondness for old women. I have collected their images, the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the 19th century. Those simpler times, particularly as they were lived in my own part of this vast state where I feel most at home." So I think Jerry Bywaters did us all a great favor by sending Clara Williamson home. And so these images, Frank Ray, Georgia O'Keeffe, great examples of certainly Frank Ray's Impressionism. We heard earlier he studied briefly at St. Louis School of Art. He, like many American artists, found himself at the Académie Julian in Paris. So he brought this training back to the land that he loved and created these Impressionist works around the Panhandle primarily. Panhandle Plains, of course, has a wonderful collection of Frank Ray, as does the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center at UT Austin. I love what O'Keeffe said about her time in Texas when she taught 1916 in Amarillo. She said, and then later came back to Canyon, "I couldn't believe Texas was real. When I arrived there wasn't a blade of green grass or a leaf to be seen, but I was absolutely crazy about it. There wasn't a tree 6 inches in diameter at that time. For me, Texas is the same big, wonderful thing that the oceans and the highest mountains are. And I was in Amarillo in the late 70s when Tom Livesey was at the Amarillo Art Center and David Turner was there. And they said, "Oh, come on, we're all going out to see the tree." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, we're going out to see the tree." And so we drove on this kind of lonesome highway, and there was this poor dead tree, you know, with this very Victorian fence around it. And it was, I think it was the first tree that somebody had planted, you know, but it was a dead tree in a fence. And every time I read that O'Keeffe quote, I think about that dead tree you all took me to see. Ah, dead tree. These two works are actually in the collection of El Paso. The first is Robert Onderdonk. He painted this picture, I believe, when he was in St. Louis, earning a living as a China painter. But he painted this buffalo hunt in 1898, and he had in mind to take it to the St. Louis Fair of 1904. And then while I was in El Paso, we had the opportunity, and a friend of the museum had donated funds, and we could buy the Julian Onderdonk small painting, this wonderful small landscape painting. So we have father and son in the collection, which is lovely. So this is in the exhibition. El Paso loaned this, 4 by 16 foot mural by the artist Audley Dean Nichols, who was El Paso based, had trained outside the country in Europe, had worked on the East Coast quite a bit, did illustrations for Scribner's and various magazines, but had tuberculosis, came west for his health, and lived out his life in El Paso. He did numerous small easel paintings of that West Texas landscape, as well as this really magnificent mural. In El Paso, I learned, you know, here, Julian Onderdonk was called the bluebonnet painter, kind of the father of the bluebonnet school, and we know he totally hated, you know, that moniker. He didn't want to carry that weight, and it became a pejorative thing to be called a bluebonnet painter. But in El Paso, I learned that same kind of amateur group of painters were called the Purple Mountain School. So evidently, you know, here you paint the bluebonnets. In El Paso, you know, with the sun hits the mountains at the right time, it's the Purple Mountain School. And of course, Otis Dozier and Alexander Hoag's Jackrabbits and Dust Bowl bring us into the regionalism period. I love that Otis Dozier painting. Those jackrabbits, you know, to me are as strong, you know, as the Oilfield Girls, you know, that these two kind of iconic animals in that almost primordial landscape, I think also helped carry on the myth of Texas, that everything's bigger. But there's just something really wonderful about the presence the rabbits hold in that landscape, the windmill in the back, and in the background, the landscape. And then, of course, the Alexander Hoag and Dust Bowl imagery really brings this period of time, the Depression time, you know, to us. So I'll tell you my story of Oilfield Girls. I was doing research in 1982, and part of doing research for an exhibition is that you really get to go meet the artist. And I working when I did, I got to meet artists like Jerry Bywaters and Everett Spruce and Tom Lee, and I knew these wonderful artists. So as I recall, I was in Jerry Bywaters' home. I don't think it was a studio. And we were talking, and I saw this painting in my memory. It's just kind of leaning against the wall. And I said, well, what about this painting? And he was really reluctant to show it to me. And I said, could I see that? And the minute I saw it, I went, oh my God, this is amazing work of art. I want to know a little bit more about it. And he said, well, it's never been shown because I was a little nervous about the subject matter. And, when I saw it, all I saw were two strong women, they're in the foreground. To me, they seemed totally in control of their lives and their fate. To me, all those iconic images of Jack's beer and Coca-Cola, that road that guides your eye right to the oil fields and the black oil burning in the background, to me that just said so much. To me, it said so much about the strength of Texas women. And so I told him I really would love that show for that painting for the show, and he agreed. And so the show opens in '83, and James Michener is in Texas, in Austin, at that time doing his research. So I was walking Michener through the galleries, and at the Huntington Art Gallery, at the Blanton, the American art collection is the Michener collection, because James Michener and his wife were collectors of American art. He often said he wanted to know what American artists were doing, just like he knew about American writers. So when we got to the wall where Oilfield Girls was, he stopped and really enjoyed looking at it, and I told him about Jerry Bywaters, and he said I'd like to get in touch with him. So I gave him Jerry Bywaters' information, and Michener called him, and then Francine filled me in on something that I didn't know, that initially, evidently, well, I heard the story I heard. James Michener said Jerry Bywaters wanted $3,000 for the painting. And so Francine told me Mr. Bywaters called her and said, what about this offer? And she said, are you crazy? You need at least twice that. So neither of us really know, because I wasn't in a position as curator to know what James Michener paid for the painting, but I would expect he paid whatever amount Jerry Bywaters asked for. So that's the story as we're piecing it together these years. But I've really been happy that this painting has become such an image, for the museum, but also, it's just for all of us. I think all of us have a very strong reaction, to the painting, and I'm so happy Jerry Bywaters is in that Michener collection, and especially this painting. So I got to know Tom and Sarah Lee in El Paso. I got there in '91, and that portrait of Sarah is a little bit different from the one that you'll see in the show. But to me, again, Tom has painted a strong Texas woman. The color, the palette Tom uses in his art is pretty typical to what you see here. The blues, the grays, the browns, the texture of Sarah's dress really seems almost to reflect the landscape and the land. It's highly textured, but placing her there in front of that El Paso, far west Texas landscape, especially sitting there facing us, but with the book in her lap, she becomes a civilizing force or symbol for the West and But again, he shows that strength of Sarah. It reflects women in general. Now, the painting in the exhibit is truly, I believe, Tom Lee's masterwork. His Sarah in the Summertime came from, he had been a war correspondent for Life magazine in World War II. And Tom was one of the few artists who really showed the horrors of war in his work. He showed missing limbs, he showed the 2,000-yard stare, he showed, the shock and horror of war. And when he came back, he had carried this picture of Sarah in his pocket throughout the war. And so when he came home, he said that was the catharsis that he needed to get the horrors and the war out of his mind. And so he painted this portrait. It's absolutely painted with love. You see it, every inch of it. When I talked to Sarah about the picture one day, she said, I still have the dress and I still have the shoes. So I think you'll I think especially want to spend time with that painting. But Tom and Sarah were, Tom had lost his first wife. He had met her when he'd studied at the Art Institute in Chicago. She was also a student. They married, moved to Santa Fe, and Nancy had an appendicitis attack and then died of infection maybe 2 months after. Tom never went back to Santa Fe. Tom was a very emotional man, even though you had to kind of get below the surface to see that. But he never went back to Santa Fe. But when he was working on his big mural for the federal courthouse building in El Paso, Sarah had come to visit friends, and she was divorced and had a son. And the friends introduced her to Tom, and they, they were just so grateful that they had found each other, and it was always wonderful to be in their presence. Of course, Tom Lee, besides being a painter, he was a writer. He told me once that in the 50s, the paintings weren't selling so much, so he thought, I'll just write. And so he wrote The Brave Bulls and The Wonderful Country. Movies were made of those two books. He was the illustrator for J. Frank Dobie's works. Tom Lee was really a man of many, many talents. He also wrote, after he died, Stanley Marcus had contacted Sarah, and Stanley produced miniature books, and he asked if Tom had a manuscript that maybe he could make into a miniature book, and she did, and it turned out to be a story, and I have a copy, it's this big. It's a story about their dog Boodles, and like Old Yeller, like any dog movie you ever see, it will make you cry because he loved that dog, and it's really a sweet story that Stanley Marcus was able to publish. This painting, I'm happy, is in the collection. Manny Acosta was also an El Paso artist. He was very influenced by Tom Lee, and in fact, in the gallery, I would have Manny's portrait of Yolanda paired with the portrait of Sarah that I just showed you. And two strong works. In fact, the Yolanda, the owner of the painting, gave this work to the museum so we could have it in perpetuity. But Manny Acosta was really important voice, force in El Paso. He taught many students and, was a wonderful artist in his own right. This is a portrait of the Texas Woman's University faculty. And there is Mary Delaney in the middle, who's standing upright. Seated, second from left, is Corinne Spellman. These women were very talented. They all came from academic backgrounds, and many of them would go to Columbia University in the summer for other training, graduate training, and both these women would go to Provincetown from time to time and paint. And there they painted with established Provincetown artists like the Fletchers, Martin and Charles Fletcher, and other artists. But in their work, you begin to see certainly the stylistic change from the regionalist into more precisionist, where there's clean lines, there's few details, it's more geometric. One writer described Marie Delaney's houses in Provincetown as cubist realist. I could see a little bit of, I don't quite see the cubism, but I sure see, it's realistic. But precisionism, I think, is more the art historical term for both of these. Very clean, very detail-free works of art by these really two talented women. These two works are also in the museum's collection. Carlotta Corcoran is the photographer on the left. She was at Texas Woman's University. She also studied, TWU brought Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the great photographer, to teach, and she was his studio assistant. Mary Doyle is the artist on the right. Here you begin to see Cubism and the influence of Cezanne. And I began to realize that this is a work, her painting is from the 50s. That by the 50s, you really began to see specific colors. You can start to see this chartreuse color, often paired with gray and browns in a number of artists' works. And it's really kind of fun, to look for that color combination, because you can almost pinpoint the decade in which it was painted. But again, Mary Doyle is looking at that Cezanne influence, that kind of tilted tabletop. But again, she places the viewer in an interior there in the background. So her still life with pears. And that too is in the museum's collection. These are two works. The figurative portrait is by Catherine Hell Travis. The small landscape studies are by Olin Travis. They met and married. They met at the Art Students League in Chicago, you've heard earlier, came to Dallas, formed the Dallas Art League, art school. And they were really the Dallas couple in the 20s. But their divorce was played out in the 30s in the newspapers. Big headlines, nasty divorce. And so this picture Catherine painted is called The Unfinished Portrait, and she painted it a year after the divorce. And I got to know her son, David, who's the young boy in the painting. And David lived in Ruidoso, and he had this painting. He gave it to the museum in El Paso on long-term loan. But he also gave me a 2-page description of all the symbolism that his mother put into that painting. Every flower, every object that was painted has to do with her life, the divorce, and you can certainly see the unhappiness in her face. So, but it's really an important painting, again, and there. Mei Shou, who was chair of the art department at Sam Houston State College from 1928 to 1962. This is her portrait from the 30s, a Mexican girl. I'm going to go fast. I think we're running out of time. This is Kathleen Blacksher, who also was at the Art Institute of Chicago. She studied there, worked there for about 40 years. She often supported African American students. She would pay their tuition so they could study at the Art Students League. And her mother she was from Navasota, so she'd go home in summers and Christmas to visit. So these two portraits, I think, came from her time back in Navasota. Alligator Boy and the two Washington girls on the right. Evelyn Sellers, who's a sculptor from Fort Worth. Patricia Hendricks and I found her in storage when we were doing the sculpture show research in the 80s. There's a little piece called Winter or the Fawn. Dorothy Austin, sculptor based in Dallas. By time of the centennial in 1936, she had had shows in MoMA, the Metropolitan. She was well known, came back to Dallas and continued her career. She lived to be 100. She died just 2010. So these really important works, those are images from the Huntington Art Gallery at that time. I love that white pine cowboy that she carved, and then the limestone two figures. Reese Soler was a Spanish artist, trained in Munich, had worked in Paris, Rome, found his way to El Paso, taught in El Paso, worked in El Paso, and so many of these artists starved, wherever they were. They often, artists still had to take day jobs to support themselves. But Reese Soler also created the El Cristo Rey sculpture, the 40-foot sculpture on the mountain that kind of sits between Mexico, Texas, and New Mexico. So his work is also in the El Paso collection. I'm going to skip Octavio Medellin and just end with this picture by Charles Umlauf, the longtime sculptor on the faculty at UT Austin. He taught from 41 to 81. His art, he is probably the most prolific sculptor whose works can be seen in Texas today. At one point, there were two big Umlauf sculptures in front of the old Witte building. I haven't had a chance to ask Maurice where they are, but Charles Umlauf's work is prevalent throughout the state. Major commissions. When you go to left field, that history of flight sculpture is Umlauf's. This is a small piece that he did in '45. It's at the Umlauf Sculpture Museum in Austin. His very expressionistic piece of Pietà. So here's what happens in the 60s and 70s, and I'm going to stop because the show doesn't really go too much farther, even though we do have Luis Jimenez on loan from UTEP, and but the formal qualities of art began to be challenged, and they changed radically by the 60s. So Luis Jimenez and his discovery of new materials, that 20th century idea of using new materials. Instead of the bronze of Rodin, he would use fiberglass and jet paint, for his colors. He was El Paso native. I had Vaquero, when we opened the new museum in El Paso, I had Vaquero on loan for a number of years, and it was a great signifier of the museum. And then James Searles, who is also a major Texas sculptor, who left us and went to Colorado. So that I'm going to stop. You all, I forgive my notes being out of order, but at least you got to see the images. So thanks. Do you all have any questions? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think during my tenure, I worked at the UT Art Department 15 years, and I had other jobs besides organizing shows. I was first head of education, then assistant director, and then interim director. But I always had this love of artists and wanted to know what they did, and no one else was doing Texas art. UT's a little arrogant about that. But I carved this niche, and I began to do shows about Texas art in 1979. Did a show called Made in Texas that was contemporary painting and sculpture, which got me out, and into the studios, into the galleries, into the museums, really getting to know the artist and the Texas art world. And then I did 1983, the Texas Images and Visions that found oil field girls. And actually, in 83, before 1983, no one could look at regionalist art. It was considered so old-fashioned that the modernist movement had taken on over. And so when I began to go out and visit Everett Spruce and Lauren Mosley and Jerry Bywaters, my eyes could see the regionalism, and my eyes could see this is really fantastic art. And so when we showed the regionalism in '83, that really kicked off a lot of interest in regionalism. Lone Star Regionalism opened in Dallas. A number of shows really began to show regionalism. And so after that, I thought, well, no one's done sculpture. So I said, let's do, like my friend James Drake, the sculptor, said, 100,000 years of Texas sculpture. But really, it was just 100. So my colleague Patricia Hendricks and I divided up the work, and my interest was always more contemporary, and she was more historic. But together, we would come here. We came here and went into storage and found all of these amazing women sculptors. I made a note. I'm going to read you some of the names of the women that we found besides Elizabeth Ney. Waldine Talk, she was one of Copini's assistants. Bonnie McCleary, Allie Victoria Tennant, Electra Wagner Biggs, Mabel Fairfax Carl, Dorothy Austin, Ione Ruth Franklin, Bess Bigham Hubbard, and Evelyn Sellers. I mean, there were wonderful women, and they were all in storage. But we brought them out into the light, and that was exciting. But just to see the range and the formality, the formal academic 19th century sculpture, how that transformed, to Luis Jimenez and, the more contemporary works. We traveled that show widely. It was the only one of the Texas shows I did that went to San Angelo, it went to Corpus, it went to El Paso. So it really got out into the state, and I think it really has helped people realize that there are a lot of really wonderful sculptors in Texas as well as painters. So, yeah. Does anybody else have any stories? I like sharing these stories, so, well, yeah. I couldn't quite hear. What did you say? Oh, that's good. I didn't know that. Great, great. I'll quit worrying about them. All right. Thank you all.